You're fired. And don't ever let me see you in this restaurant again." The words landed harder than the cold November rain beating against the glass walls of Whitfield Prime, Manhattan's most exclusive executive dining club, where billion-dollar mergers were negotiated over handcrafted espresso and whispered promises. Every fork stopped halfway to a plate. Every conversation faded into an uneasy silence. Every member of the staff looked away, pretending they hadn't heard what had just happened. Only one person kept looking. 4-year-old Matteo Delgado stood beside the service station, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit almost as big as his tiny chest. He didn't understand what fired meant. He only knew his mommy suddenly looked different. Maria Delgado didn't argue. She didn't beg. She didn't raise her voice. 6 years of loyal service had taught her something most people in power never learned. Dignity becomes strongest the moment pride is taken away. She simply removed her black apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the polished counter with hands that refused to shake. Behind her, crystal chandeliers continued glowing as if nothing had happened. The wealthy guests returned to their conversations one careful sentence at a time. Expensive watches kept ticking. Fresh coffee kept pouring. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz pianist played another familiar melody. Life inside Whitfield Prime moved on exactly as if one woman's entire world hadn't just collapsed. Maria bent down, smiled softly at her son, and picked up his little backpack from beneath the service shelf. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going home." Home. The word felt almost impossible to say. $43 and some loose change sat inside her purse. Her aging Honda had been coughing every morning for weeks. Rent was due in 5 days. Her son's preschool tuition had already been postponed once. She had spent years believing that if she worked harder than everyone else, arrived earlier, stayed later, smiled longer, eventually someone would notice. Someone had, just not for the reason she deserved. Less than 20 minutes earlier, the restaurant's general manager had gathered the entire staff into the employee corridor behind the main dining room. A diamond bracelet worth nearly $300,000 had disappeared from the private executive lounge. Security records showed only 3 employees had accessed the room before closing. Maria's name appeared on the list. She insisted there had to be a mistake. She had spent the evening serving a private technology dinner on the opposite side of the restaurant. Several co-workers could confirm it. None of that seemed to matter. Policies were quoted. Procedures were repeated. Decisions had already been made long before anyone asked for the truth. As Maria reached the employee exit, little Matteo quietly slipped his tiny hand into the pocket of his blue jacket, touching a business card he had carried for months without ever showing his mother. The number written across the back belonged to someone almost nobody could reach directly. Months earlier, during one unusually quiet breakfast before an early board meeting, the billionaire CEO himself had smiled at the curious little boy stacking sugar packets into skyscrapers and jokingly tucked that card into his jacket. "Only for emergencies, buddy," Richard Whitfield had said with a grin before walking out to change another industry. Matteo couldn't read. He didn't know what a billionaire CEO was. He didn't understand wealth, power, or influence. But children have a remarkable way of recognizing kindness. And before another sunrise arrived over Manhattan, one innocent phone call would force an entire empire to confront something money could never buy: the truth. Maria drove through the rain with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, not because the streets of Manhattan were difficult to navigate, but because she was trying to hold together a life that had begun falling apart before lunch. The windshield wipers pushed sheets of water aside in steady rhythm, yet nothing cleared the weight pressing against her chest. In the back seat, Matteo hugged his stuffed rabbit and watched raindrops race across the window, completely unaware that tomorrow would not look like yesterday. He leaned forward after several quiet minutes and asked the question every parent fears when life changes without warning. "Mommy, are you coming back to the restaurant tomorrow?" Maria forced a smile into the rearview mirror even though her eyes felt heavy. "Not tomorrow, sweetheart." Matteo tilted his head with innocent confusion. "Did you finish your job?" She paused before answering because children deserved honesty, even when adults wished reality sounded kinder. "Someone thinks Mommy made a mistake." The little boy frowned. "But you always tell me to tell the truth." Those simple words settled into the silence more heavily than anything said inside Whitfield Prime earlier that morning. Maria swallowed the lump in her throat and reached one hand toward the back seat until Mateo wrapped his tiny fingers around hers. "Sometimes the truth takes a little longer to arrive," she whispered. Their apartment sat on the third floor of an aging brick building in Queens, where the elevator worked only when it wanted to, and the hallway always smelled faintly of fresh laundry and old paint. It was not glamorous, but it was home. Maria unlocked the door, switched on the small kitchen light, and immediately noticed the stack of envelopes waiting on the counter. Rent, electric bill, preschool tuition reminder. She quietly turned every envelope face down before Mateo could ask questions she could not answer. After heating a simple bowl of tomato soup and making grilled cheese sandwiches, she sat across from her son at the tiny kitchen table that barely fit the two of them. Mateo happily dipped his sandwich into the soup as though nothing in the world had changed. Children measured wealth differently. A warm meal, a favorite toy, and someone who stayed beside them often meant everything. Maria watched him smile and silently promised herself that whatever happened next, she would protect that smile for as long as she possibly could. Later that evening, after Mateo had fallen asleep beneath his faded dinosaur blanket, Maria opened her laptop and began searching for restaurant jobs. Fine dining, hotels, catering companies, coffee shops. Every application looked the same. Every requirement blurred together after hours of reading. She stopped only when her phone buzzed with a message from a former coworker. "I am so sorry. None of us believed it was you." A second message followed almost immediately. "Please do not tell anyone I texted. Management warned us not to discuss what happened." Maria stared at the screen. Fear had spread through Whitfield Prime faster than truth ever could. She closed the laptop shortly after midnight, exhausted but unable to sleep. Across the hallway, inside his small bedroom, Mateo woke briefly after hearing distant thunder. Still half asleep, he reached into the pocket of the blue jacket hanging from his little chair. His fingers brushed against a stiff business card he had nearly forgotten. He smiled softly, remembering the tall man who had laughed when they built sugar packet towers together and who had told him with complete confidence, "If you ever have a real emergency, you can call me." Mateo did not know what emergencies looked like. He only knew his mommy was sad, and somehow that felt exactly like one. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray skies and cold air, but inside Whitfield Prime, business unfolded with the same polished perfection guests expected from one of the most exclusive executive dining clubs in New York City. Fresh flowers replaced yesterday's arrangements before sunrise. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath golden lights. White linen covered every table without a single wrinkle. To the customers walking through the revolving doors, nothing appeared different. Only the employees knew that something invisible had settled over the restaurant overnight. Conversations stopped whenever the general manager walked past. Smiles became rehearsed. Eye contact disappeared. Everyone understood the unspoken rule. Do your job. Ask no questions. Forget Maria Delgado ever worked here. Diane Sinclair stood inside her office overlooking the dining room, reviewing incident reports with calm precision. On paper, everything appeared complete. Access logs had been printed. Suspension paperwork had been filed. Security footage had been archived. Yet one detail refused to leave her thoughts. The bracelet had still not been found. She convinced herself it did not matter. Without evidence clearing Maria, the story would eventually fade. Employees would move on. Guests would forget. Restaurants survived on reputation, not memories. Across town, Maria woke before dawn out of habit. For 6 years, her mornings had started before the city stretched awake. Even without a job, her body still followed the same clock. She quietly brewed coffee, packed a peanut butter sandwich for Mateo, and searched through another list of restaurant openings while he colored dinosaurs beside the kitchen table. Every application required references. Every interview asked why she had left her previous employer. She stared at the blinking cursor, unable to decide whether honesty would help or destroy her chances. At nearly the same hour, Richard Whitfield stepped out of a black SUV in Lower Manhattan after returning from a 3-day business trip in Seattle. His schedule was already overflowing. Investor meeting at 8. Product launch review at 10. Charity board luncheon at noon. Conference call with Singapore before sunset. His executive assistant walked beside him, reading appointments from a digital tablet without looking up. Richard listened with only half his attention. Years of building a technology empire had trained him to process information quickly while noticing details other people ignored. As they entered headquarters, he paused unexpectedly beside the reception desk where a bowl of individually wrapped peppermints sat untouched. Something about the bright colors reminded him of a little boy who used to build tiny skyscrapers from sugar packets while waiting for his mother to finish her shift. Richard smiled almost without realizing it. "What was that kid's name?" he asked suddenly. His assistant looked confused. "Which kid?" "The little boy at Whitfield Prime. Curly hair. Always carrying a stuffed rabbit." She searched her memory before answering. "I believe his name was Mateo." Richard nodded absent-mindedly as the elevator doors opened. "Cute kid." The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds before another meeting claimed his attention, yet somewhere in the back of his mind, an unfinished thought lingered. He had not seen the boy in months. Meanwhile, inside the apartment in Queens, Mateo finished drawing a picture with blue crayons. It showed 3 stick figures standing beside a restaurant with enormous windows. One was Mommy. One was himself. The third figure wore an oversized suit with a smiling face. Above him, the little boy carefully copied several numbers exactly as they appeared on the business card resting beside his coloring book. He still could not read every word printed across it, but he recognized numbers. Children often remember the smallest promises long after adults forget making them. And before this quiet morning reached its end, one promise made in passing was about to become the most important conversation of Richard Whitfield's entire career. Maria spent the afternoon walking from one restaurant to another with a folder tucked beneath her arm, each resume printed on crisp white paper that represented 6 years of loyalty and experience now reduced to a handful of bullet points. Some managers accepted the application with polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Others glanced at her previous employer, recognized the name Whitfield Prime, and promised they would call. She knew that promise. It sounded comforting because it cost nothing to say. By late afternoon, the November wind had turned colder, and she found herself sitting on a bench outside a neighborhood playground while Mateo climbed the small slide with the fearless confidence only children possess. He laughed every time he reached the bottom, completely unaware that his mother was calculating how many groceries $43 could still buy. Maria watched him run across the rubber playground surface and remembered the countless evenings he had spent quietly coloring in the employee break room while she finished her shift. Not once had he complained. Not once had he asked why other children had parents home before sunset. He simply believed his mother helped people eat dinner, and somehow that made her important. That belief alone made Maria straighten her shoulders. She refused to let one false accusation become the story her son remembered. Back in Midtown, Whitfield Prime prepared for another evening of influential guests and private business dinners. Diane Sinclair walked through the dining room, inspecting every table with practiced precision, correcting the placement of a wine glass by less than an inch, adjusting folded napkins, reminding servers that excellence lived inside details. Yet beneath her composed expression, tension quietly lingered. One of the security supervisors approached and spoke in a careful voice. The review of the surveillance recordings had revealed nothing unusual beyond what had already been documented. No image clearly showed the bracelet leaving the executive lounge. Diane thanked him, dismissed him, and immediately instructed that no further discussion take place unless requested by corporate leadership. Loose questions created unnecessary problems. Upstairs, inside the executive offices, another manager hesitated before opening an email addressed to Richard Whitfield. It contained the routine daily operational summary, including a brief line noting that a senior employee had been terminated pending investigation involving missing property. The message blended into dozens of other updates waiting for review. No one expected the billionaire chief executive officer to notice a single personnel report buried beneath financial projections, investor briefings, and expansion plans. Meanwhile, across the city, Mateo sat at the small coffee table in the apartment, still studying the business card resting beside his drawing. He traced the raised silver letters with one tiny finger before carefully matching the numbers again onto another sheet of paper. Maria, busy preparing macaroni and cheese for dinner, smiled without looking up. "What are you drawing now?" she asked. "A phone," Mateo answered proudly. "For my friend." Maria laughed softly, assuming he meant another child from preschool. "That is nice, sweetheart." She never walked over to see the card lying beneath his crayons. She never imagined that one ordinary piece of cardstock carried the private direct number of one of the busiest executives in America. Outside, the first city lights flickered on as dusk settled over New York. Thousands of people hurried home, believing tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. But somewhere between an exhausted mother searching for hope and a little boy holding on to a forgotten promise, the quiet pieces of something extraordinary were already falling perfectly into place. Morning arrived quietly, carrying the kind of calm that often comes just before everything changes. Sunlight slipped through the apartment blinds, painting thin golden lines across the kitchen floor where Mateo sat eating cereal with his stuffed rabbit balanced on the chair beside him. Maria had already left for a walk-in interview at a small family restaurant in Brooklyn, asking the elderly neighbor across the hall to watch him for an hour. She kissed his forehead before leaving and promised she would not be gone long. "Be good for Miss Eleanor," she said with a tired smile. Mateo nodded obediently. "I will." The apartment became unusually quiet after the front door closed. Miss Eleanor folded laundry in the bedroom, while an old radio played softly from the windowsill. Mateo wandered back to the living room carrying his drawing, the silver business card, and the toy telephone he loved pretending with. He stared at the numbers again. Children rarely understand the difference between imagination and possibility. To Mateo, promises were always real because adults were supposed to keep them. He remembered the tall man who had laughed when they built little towers from sugar packets inside the restaurant. He remembered the warm handshake, the smile, and the words spoken with complete confidence. "If you ever have a real emergency, call me." Mommy was sad. Mommy did not go back to the restaurant. Mommy kept pretending everything was fine when it clearly was not. That felt like the biggest emergency a 4-year-old could imagine. He quietly climbed onto the chair beside the kitchen counter where the family telephone rested. Stretching on his tiptoes, he picked up the receiver with both hands and carefully placed the business card in front of him. One number at a time, he matched each button exactly as he had copied them onto his drawing the day before. Across Manhattan, inside a sleek conference room 40 stories above the city, Richard Whitfield listened as executives presented quarterly projections across 3 enormous digital screens. Charts filled the walls. Investors joined remotely from London, Tokyo, and San Francisco. Every minute of the meeting represented millions of dollars in future decisions. Then, without warning, the smartphone resting beside Richard's notebook began vibrating. He glanced at the screen. No caller identification. Only the private number that almost no one possessed. He normally ignored unknown calls during board meetings. This one felt different. Something made him reach for the phone before the second ring ended. Richard Whitfield speaking. He answered calmly while the room fell silent around him. For a moment, only soft breathing came through the speaker. Then a tiny voice asked with complete sincerity, "Mr. Richard?" Richard frowned gently, searching his memory. "Yes. Who is this?" Another pause followed before the little voice answered. "It is Mateo. My mommy is crying." Every executive around the table watched as something unexpected crossed Richard's face. It was not frustration. It was recognition. He leaned back slowly in his chair, lowering his voice. "Mateo." The little boy smiled with relief. "You remembered me." Richard looked through the conference room windows toward the skyline without truly seeing it anymore. Numbers, contracts, and presentations disappeared from his thoughts. All he could picture was a little boy stacking sugar packets into tiny buildings while waiting patiently for his mother to finish another long shift. "Tell me what happened," Richard said quietly. And on the other end of the line, with all the honesty only a child possesses, Mateo began telling a story that would unravel everything Richard believed he already knew. The conference room remained completely silent long after the presentation screens had gone dark. Executives who had spent decades negotiating international acquisitions now found themselves watching their billionaire chief executive officer speak with a 4-year-old boy whose voice barely rose above a whisper. Richard listened without interrupting. Mateo did not know how to tell a complicated story. He simply described what he had seen. "Mommy came home early. She smiled, but her eyes were sad. She said somebody thought she did something bad. But my mommy does not tell lies. She always says telling the truth is important." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. There was something about the complete certainty in the child's voice that no corporate report could imitate. Children did not build narratives to protect themselves. They simply repeated what they believed. "Is your mommy there now?" Richard asked gently. "No. She went to find another restaurant because she said we need money for rent." Another pause followed. "Mr. Richard?" "Yes, buddy. Did my mommy do something wrong?" The question settled over the room with a weight no financial forecast could match. Richard answered without hesitation. "I do not know yet, Mateo, but I promise you I am going to find out." The little boy smiled into the phone. "Okay. Mommy says promises are important." Richard looked toward his assistant standing near the conference room door. "Can you stay with Miss Eleanor until your mommy comes home?" "Yes. She makes really good cookies." Richard could not help smiling. "Good. Stay there and take care of your rabbit for me." "I will." The call ended, but nobody at the table moved. Richard slowly placed his phone on the polished conference table before turning toward the dozen executives waiting for the meeting to continue. Instead, he calmly closed his notebook. "Reschedule everything afternoon." His assistant blinked in surprise. "Everything? Everything? The investor luncheon? Reschedule it. The expansion review? Move it." She had worked beside Richard for nearly 8 years. Never once had she seen him cancel an entire morning of meetings. He built his reputation on discipline, precision, and relentless commitment. If he interrupted his own calendar, something truly mattered. Richard stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. "Contact Whitfield Prime immediately," he said without turning around. "I want every report concerning Maria Delgado on my desk within 30 minutes. His assistant hesitated. "The terminated waitress?" Richard turned slowly. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable purpose behind his eyes. "Her name is Maria Delgado." The correction echoed quietly through the room. He continued, "I also want complete security footage from the executive lounge, all access records, inventory logs, employee schedules, and every internal communication connected to the missing bracelet. Nothing edited, nothing summarized." One executive finally spoke. "Richard, if this concerns a routine personnel issue, operations can handle it." Richard met his gaze with measured composure. "Routine issues do not lead 4-year-old children to call a private emergency number I personally gave them." Nobody offered another opinion. Across town, Maria stepped out of the small neighborhood restaurant after finishing her interview. The manager had thanked her politely and explained that several candidates were still being considered. It was neither a rejection nor a promise. Just another uncertain answer in a week filled with them. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and began walking toward the subway, unaware that at that very moment, inside corporate headquarters, an entire chain of events had already begun moving in her direction, driven not by wealth or influence, but by a simple promise made to a child who had believed every single word. The first file arrived 23 minutes later. Then another. Then another. Richard Whitfield stood alone inside his private office as confidential reports continued appearing on the large display built into the wall. Employee schedules, security access records, inventory logs, incident summaries. Everything had been assembled with impressive speed, yet something about the investigation immediately felt incomplete. Richard had built a multi-billion-dollar technology company by recognizing patterns others overlooked, and the pattern in front of him made no sense. Maria Delgado had worked at Whitfield Prime for 6 years without a single disciplinary report. Not one customer complaint. Not one written warning. Annual performance evaluations described her with nearly identical words every year. Dependable. Professional. Trusted. Exceptional under pressure. She had trained new employees, volunteered for difficult shifts, and regularly received handwritten compliments from guests. People like that did not suddenly risk everything for a bracelet. Richard pressed the intercom. "Bring me human resources." 5 minutes later, the director entered carrying an additional folder. Richard opened it immediately. Inside were dozens of customer comment cards. One elderly couple praised Maria for quietly helping them celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary after learning they had lost their original reservation. A business traveler thanked her for finding an important presentation folder accidentally left behind. Another guest wrote that she remembered his daughter's food allergy without being reminded 6 months later. Richard continued turning pages in silence. Character revealed itself through ordinary moments, not extraordinary accusations. Finally, he looked up. Who authorized her termination? The human resources director cleared her throat carefully. Technically, she was suspended pending investigation. However, General Manager Diane Sinclair processed the separation paperwork yesterday afternoon under internal asset protection procedures. Richard frowned. Before the missing bracelet was recovered? Yes. Before law enforcement completed any investigation? Another hesitant pause. Yes. Richard closed the folder slowly. That is not procedure. Across town, Diane Sinclair was reviewing reservation requests when her office phone rang. She answered confidently, expecting another supplier or event coordinator. Instead, she heard the voice of Richard's executive assistant. Calm, professional, unusually brief. Mr. Whitfield requests your immediate presence at corporate headquarters at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Diane glanced at the clock. Is this regarding next quarter's expansion? No. May I ask what this concerns? Mr. Whitfield will discuss that personally. The line disconnected before another question could be asked. For the first time since Maria left the restaurant, Diane felt genuine uncertainty settle into her thoughts. Meanwhile, Maria arrived home carrying a paper bag containing 2 discounted bakery rolls the restaurant manager had offered after her interview. It was not a job, but it was dinner. Mateo ran toward her the moment she opened the apartment door. Mommy, I talked to Mr. Richard. Maria smiled distractedly while hanging up her coat. That is nice, sweetheart. Did you dream about him? Mateo shook his head with complete confidence. No, I used the phone because you were sad. Maria froze. Slowly, she turned toward the kitchen counter where the home telephone rested. Then she noticed the silver business card lying beside his crayons. Her heartbeat quickened. She knelt until they were face to face. Mateo, did you really call him? The little boy nodded proudly. He remembered my name. He said he promised to find the truth. Maria stared silently at the business card resting on the table. Until that moment, she had never even known it existed. And somewhere across Manhattan, Richard Whitfield was preparing to ask questions that would force every person involved to answer for decisions they never expected anyone to examine. Diane Sinclair arrived at corporate headquarters 15 minutes early, something she had always believed reflected professionalism. This afternoon, however, punctuality offered little comfort. The reception area felt unusually quiet as Richard Whitfield's executive assistant greeted her with a polite smile that revealed nothing. Mr. Whitfield is expecting you, she said before leading Diane through a corridor lined with photographs celebrating company milestones, magazine covers, and charitable initiatives built around one simple philosophy that Richard often repeated during leadership conferences. Trust is earned one decision at a time. Diane had quoted those same words to employees dozens of times. Today they sounded different. Inside the executive office, Richard stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. He did not invite Diane to sit. He did not begin with small talk. Instead, he placed a single employee file on the conference table between them. How long has Maria Delgado worked at Whitfield Prime? Diane answered immediately. 6 years. How many disciplinary actions before this week? None. Richard nodded once. How many customer complaints? None that I am aware of. How many commendations? Diane hesitated. Several. Richard opened the folder and slowly spread handwritten guest comments across the table. 38 documented compliments over 6 years. 3 employee recognition awards. Outstanding performance evaluations. Consistent recommendations for promotion. Does that sound accurate? Diane quietly answered, yes. Richard looked directly at her. Then explained why an employee with that record was removed before the investigation was complete. Diane maintained her professional tone. The access records placed her among the individuals who entered the executive lounge. Company policy requires immediate action whenever valuable property is reported missing. Richard folded his hands. Suspension requires immediate action. Permanent separation does not. The room fell silent. Diane searched for another explanation. The circumstances appeared compelling. Richard remained calm. Compelling is not evidence. He picked up another document. I reviewed the security access log. 3 employees entered the executive lounge that evening. Yet only one lost a career within 24 hours. Help me understand why. Diane felt the confidence she had carried into the building beginning to slip away. Thomas Reyes had already been verified as attending a family event. Correct. Richard nodded. And you? She blinked. Excuse me. Your name also appears on the access record. Diane looked at the table. Yes. Richard continued, speaking with measured precision. So by your own reasoning, there were two people present after Mr. Reyes was cleared. You and Maria Delgado. Why was only one treated as guilty? Before Diane could answer, another knock interrupted the conversation. Richard's head of corporate security entered carrying a tablet. Sir, we completed the expanded review you requested. Richard accepted the device and watched several surveillance clips without speaking. The camera outside the executive lounge showed employees entering and leaving throughout the evening. Nothing appeared unusual until the final angle displayed a maintenance hallway rarely monitored during routine reviews. Richard paused the recording. Back it up 10 seconds. The video replayed. A staff member pushed a rolling linen cart past the camera. Another employee briefly stepped into the hallway moments later. The image was partially obstructed, but one detail immediately caught Richard's attention. The timestamp did not match the written incident report. Someone had omitted nearly 18 minutes from the original timeline. Richard slowly lowered the tablet and looked back toward Diane. His expression never became angry. It became something far more unsettling. Certain. I believe, he said quietly. This investigation is only beginning. Richard watched the surveillance footage again, this time without anyone speaking. Years of leading a technology company had taught him that the smallest inconsistency often uncovered the biggest truth. The maintenance hallway recording lasted only 26 seconds, yet within those few moments, the entire narrative began shifting. The linen cart entered the corridor at 9:38 in the evening. 2 minutes later, an employee emerged from the executive lounge carrying nothing visible before disappearing behind the same cart for several seconds, completely hidden from the primary security camera. Then the cart continued toward the service elevators. Richard paused the recording once more. Who was assigned to that linen cart route? The head of corporate security opened another file. Night Service Coordinator Benjamin Cross, sir. Richard scanned the schedule. Benjamin had not been interviewed during the original investigation because his responsibilities officially never included the executive lounge. That answer immediately raised another question. Who approved his assignment change? Another page turned. According to staffing records, General Manager Diane Sinclair authorized the adjustment that afternoon because another employee reported feeling ill. Richard slowly looked toward Diane, who remained standing across the conference table with noticeably less confidence than when she first entered the office. Was that staffing change documented before or after the bracelet disappeared? Corporate security answered before Diane could speak. After reviewing the system logs, we discovered the schedule modification was entered at 6:15 the following morning, approximately 9 hours after the incident. Richard said nothing for several long seconds. Silence, when used carefully, often revealed more than accusations. Finally, he asked one simple question. Can schedule records normally be edited after a shift ends? Only by senior management, the security director replied. Richard nodded thoughtfully before requesting one final report. Bring me the electronic access history for the executive lounge safe itself. Within minutes, another document appeared. Unlike the earlier summary, this report listed every unsuccessful attempt as well as successful entries. Richard noticed something unusual immediately. The safe had registered 2 incorrect access code attempts shortly before the correct code was entered. Maria had opened that safe hundreds of times over 6 years while preparing private dining events. She knew the code by memory. She would not have entered it incorrectly twice. Richard slid the report across the table toward Diane. Can you explain this? Diane studied the document, searching for an answer that never came. Richard remained composed. Someone unfamiliar with the code tried twice before succeeding. That tells me the person opening the safe was guessing. The room became almost impossibly still. At Whitfield Prime, meanwhile, whispers had already begun spreading among employees after corporate security quietly requested archived footage, inventory records, and personal statements from every manager on duty. Staff members exchanged uncertain glances while pretending to polish glasses and arrange silverware. Nobody knew exactly what had changed, only that headquarters had suddenly become interested in details previously dismissed. Across Queens, Maria tucked Mateo into bed after reading his favorite picture book. Before turning off the bedroom light, The little boy looked up with complete confidence and asked, "Do you think Mr. Richard found the truth yet?" Maria gently brushed a curl away from his forehead and smiled, although she had no idea how much had already happened because of one innocent phone call. "I hope so," she whispered. Miles away, Richard Whitfield closed the final report and looked toward the head of corporate security. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "Effective immediately, restrict system access for everyone involved in the original investigation. Nobody deletes a file. Nobody changes another record. Tomorrow morning, every manager will answer the same questions again. This time, we are not looking for someone to blame. We are looking for the truth. And the truth," he said quietly while closing the folder, "has a way of surviving even when people try to bury it."